On the night of August 17th, 1980, at a campground near one of Australia's most iconic landmarks, a mother's terrified scream pierced the darkness. "A dingo's got my baby." What followed would become one of the most infamous criminal cases in Australian history, a story of tragedy, injustice, flawed forensic science, media hysteria, and a mother wrongfully imprisoned for murdering her own child. This is the story of Azaria Chamberlain, a 9-week-old baby who was taken from her family's tent at Uluru, known then as Ayers Rock. It's the story of Lindy Chamberlain, a mother who told the truth from the beginning but wasn't believed. And it's the story of how an entire nation got it wrong, how forensic evidence can be dangerously misleading, and how prejudice and assumption can destroy innocent lives. The phrase, "a dingo ate my baby," has become embedded in popular culture, often used as a punchline or reference in movies and television shows. But behind that phrase lies a real tragedy, a real family torn apart, and a real miscarriage of justice that took 32 years to fully correct. This case changed Australia forever, affecting how the justice system handles forensic evidence, how the media reports on criminal cases, and how society judges grieving parents. Azaria Chantal Lauren Chamberlain was born on June 11th, 1980 inches, Mount Isa, Queensland. She was the third child and first daughter of Michael and Lindy Chamberlain. Her name, Azaria, pronounced Azaria, came from Hebrew and meant blessed of God. She weighed 6 pounds 5 ounces at birth and had dark violet eyes, black hair, and olive skin. She was a healthy, beautiful baby who brought joy to her family. Lindy Chamberlain, born Alice Lynn Murchison, was a New Zealand-born woman who had married Michael Chamberlain in 1969. Lindy was known for her strong personality, her dedication to her faith, and her skills as a dressmaker. She specialized in making wedding dresses to order and was deeply involved in her husband's church work. Lindy had always wanted a daughter, and when Azaria was born in June 1980, she was overjoyed. Michael Chamberlain was a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, serving at the Mount Isa Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was a dedicated minister, a loving father, and a man of strong faith. Michael and Lindy also had 2 young sons, Aidan, who was 6 years old in August 1980, and Reagan, who was 4. The family was close-knit religious and by all accounts happy and stable. At 9 weeks old, Azaria was a thriving infant. She had dark eyes that her mother described as almost violet in certain lights. She was reaching developmental milestones appropriately and was generally a content baby. Lindy dressed Azaria in clothes she had sewn herself, including a black dress with white trim that would later become a subject of malicious rumors. The family took many photographs of Azaria, treasuring every moment with their baby daughter. In August 1980, the Chamberlain family decided to take a camping vacation to Central Australia. Michael planned to do some barramundi fishing, and Lindy wanted to visit Uluru, the massive sandstone monolith in the Northern Territory that she had wanted to see for years. The family looked forward to several days of camping, exploring, and spending time together in one of Australia's most spectacular natural settings. On August 13th, 1980, the Chamberlains left their home in Mount Isa, loading up their yellow 1977 Holden Torana hatchback with camping gear, supplies, and their 3 children. They drove west and then south toward Uluru, a journey of several hundred kilometers through the heart of the Australian outback. The family arrived at the Ayers Rock campground late on the night of August 16th, exhausted from the long drive but excited for their vacation. The Ayers Rock campground in August 1980 was a popular destination for tourists and families. The campsite featured designated tent areas, a communal barbecue area where campers could cook and socialize, toilet facilities, and spectacular views of Uluru. The campground was managed by park rangers who monitored the area and provided information to visitors about the rock and the surrounding environment. On the morning of August 17, 1980, Michael and the 2 boys set out to climb portions of Uluru. Lindy stayed at the campsite with baby Azaria as the climb would be too challenging for a woman with a 9-week-old infant. The family spent a pleasant day exploring the area, taking photographs, and enjoying the unique landscape. They met other families at the campground and chatted with fellow campers, forming the casual friendships that often develop among travelers. During their time at the campground, the Chamberlains had several encounters with dingoes. Dingoes are wild dogs native to Australia, and they were common around Uluru in 1980. The Chamberlains, like many visitors, found the dingoes interesting, and even fed one a crust of bread when it approached their camp. This was not unusual behavior at the time, though park rangers had been warning that the dingoes in the area were becoming increasingly bold and aggressive. Derek Roth, the chief ranger at Uluru, had been deeply concerned about the dingo situation for at least 2 years before August 1980. Roth had written multiple letters to government authorities, urging a dingo cull and warning that an imminent human tragedy was likely if action wasn't taken. He documented numerous incidents of dingoes approaching, campers entering tents, stealing food, and even biting people. His warnings were largely ignored. On the evening of August 17, 1980, the Chamberlain family prepared dinner at the communal barbecue area. This was a covered outdoor space with picnic tables and cooking facilities where campers gathered to prepare meals and socialize. The Chamberlains chatted with other families, including Greg and Sally Lowe and their baby, and several other campers. It was a pleasant, ordinary evening under the outback sky. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Lindy took Reagan and Azaria back to the family's tent to put them to bed. The tent was pitched close to their yellow Torana, about 30 to 35 meters from the barbecue area. Lindy settled 4-year-old Reagan into a sleeping bag and placed Azaria in a bassinet inside the tent. Azaria was wearing a white disposable nappy, a white singlet, a white stretch jumpsuit with a pattern, and a matinee jacket over the jumpsuit. Lindy then returned to the barbecue area, leaving both children sleeping in the tent. The distance from the barbecue area to the Chamberlain tent was short enough that Lindy could keep an eye on the tent from where she sat. Other campers were nearby, and there were people moving around the campground. It felt safe, and leaving children sleeping in tents while parents socialized nearby was common practice at camping grounds in 1980. No one had any reason to feel alarmed. At approximately 8:00 p.m., witnesses heard a baby's cry from the direction of the Chamberlain tent. It was the kind of cry that gets a mother's attention, and Lindy immediately stood up to check on Azaria. As she approached the tent, moving quickly in the fading light, Lindy saw something that would change her life forever. She saw a dingo leaving the tent area, moving away with something in its mouth. She couldn't see what it was carrying because of the angle and the failing light, but the image was seared into her memory. Lindy ran to the tent and looked inside. Reagan was still in his sleeping bag, but the bassinet where Azaria had been sleeping was empty. Azaria was gone. In a moment of pure terror and disbelief, Lindy ran back toward the barbecue area, screaming words that would echo through Australian history. "A dingo's got my baby." The desperate cry brought everyone at the campground running. Michael and the other campers immediately began searching. They grabbed flashlights and spread out in all directions from the tent, calling for Azaria, looking for any sign of the baby or the dingo. The search was frantic and immediate. Michael ran across the sand dunes behind the tent, calling his daughter's name. Other men searched the scrub and rocks near the campsite. Women comforted Lindy and helped organize the search efforts. Sally Lowe, who had been at the barbecue area with the Chamberlains later, gave crucial testimony about that night. She confirmed that she heard a baby cry at approximately 8:00 p.m. at a time when Lindy was clearly visible at the barbecue area. This meant Azaria was alive in the tent after Lindy had returned to the fire. Sally also testified that she heard a noise she described as a menacing growl coming from the direction of the Chamberlain tent shortly before the baby's cry. Another witness, Judith West, was camped about 30 meters away from the Chamberlains. She testified to hearing what she identified as a dog's low, throaty growl coming from the direction of the Chamberlain tent. This was the kind of sound her husband's dogs made when they were guarding or protecting something, or when they were engaged in predatory behavior. The timing of this growl matched the timeline of events that Lindy described. The initial search continued for hours into the night. Rangers were called and additional park staff joined the search. They looked in caves behind rocks and dense scrub and all around the campground. Dingo tracks were found near the tent, and Ranger Derek Roth examined these tracks professionally. The search expanded wider and wider from the campsite, but there was no sign of baby Azaria. It was as if she had simply vanished into the vast darkness of the outback. The police were notified, and officers from Alice Springs, the nearest substantial town, drove to Uluru that night. The initial responding officers examined the scene, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed the physical evidence. The consensus among the first officers on the scene was that the evidence supported the Chamberlains' account. A dingo had taken the baby. Tragically, the baby was almost certainly dead, as a dingo would not keep an infant alive. Over the following days, the search intensified. Hundreds of volunteers, police officers, park rangers, and Aboriginal trackers scoured an enormous area around Uluru. They searched caves, crevices, dingo dens, and the vast expanse of scrubland surrounding the rock. Helicopters conducted aerial searches. It was one of the largest search operations ever mounted in Central Australia. Despite these massive efforts, no trace of Azaria's body was found. 7 days after Azaria's disappearance, on August 24, 1980, a crucial discovery was made. A tourist found items of Azaria's blood-stained clothing near the base of Uluru, approximately 4 kilometers from the campsite. The clothing included Azaria's singlet and the white jumpsuit she had been wearing. The clothing was blood-stained, particularly around the neck area, and it appeared to have been removed from the baby's body. However, the matinee jacket that Lindy insisted Azaria had been wearing over the jumpsuit was not found. The discovery of the clothing was both confirming and puzzling. It confirmed that something terrible had happened to Azaria. The blood on the clothing suggested she had been killed. The location where the clothing was found, 4 kilometers from the tent, suggested that a dingo could have dragged or carried the baby and the clothing there. However, the condition of the clothing would become a major source of controversy and would be central to the case against Lindy Chamberlain. Forensic examinations of the clothing began immediately. Different experts examined the jumpsuit and singlet looking for evidence that would explain what had happened to Azaria. Some of these initial examinations would later be proven to be deeply flawed, but at the time they were accepted as scientific fact. The absence of the matinee jacket was particularly noted, and questions were raised about whether Lindy's claim that Azaria had been wearing one was truthful. The first coronial inquest into Azaria's death opened in Alice Springs on December 16, 1980, before Magistrate Denny Barrett. This inquest would hear from numerous witnesses, including the Chamberlains, other campers who were present that night, park rangers, forensic experts, and police officers. The inquest lasted several weeks and was covered extensively by the media. Australia watched as the tragedy at Ayers Rock was examined in detail. During the first inquest, eyewitness testimony strongly supported the Chamberlains' version of events. Fellow campers testified that they heard a baby cry at a time when Lindy was clearly at the barbecue area away from the tent. Witnesses described hearing a menacing growl. Multiple people confirmed seeing dingoes in the campground that evening. Greg and Sally Lowe, who had been with the Chamberlains at the barbecue, testified that the Chamberlains were a loving family and that Lindy showed appropriate distress when Azaria disappeared. Derek Roth, the senior park ranger, gave important testimony about dingo behavior at Uluru. He told the inquest that dingoes in the area had become increasingly aggressive over the previous 2 years. He described multiple incidents where dingoes had entered tents, taken items, and approached or bitten humans. He stated clearly that in his professional opinion, a dingo was capable of taking a baby from a tent. He emphasized that he had been warning authorities about this danger for years. On February 20, 1981, Coroner Dennis Barrett delivered his findings. In an unprecedented move, Barrett allowed his concluding remarks to be televised live, the first time this had ever happened in Australia. Barrett found that Azaria Chamberlain had been taken and killed by a dingo. He cleared Michael and Lindy Chamberlain of any involvement in their daughter's death. Barrett also made a remarkable statement directed at the Chamberlains themselves. Barrett told the Chamberlains, "You have not only suffered the loss of your beloved child in the most tragic circumstances, but you have all been subjected to months of innuendo suspicion and probably the most malicious gossip ever heard in this country." This statement acknowledged what had been happening since August 1980. The Chamberlains, particularly Lindy, had been subjected to enormous public scrutiny, suspicion, and cruel rumors. From the moment news of Azaria's disappearance became public, certain segments of the media and the public treated the story with suspicion. Lindy's demeanor in interviews struck some people as too calm, too controlled, not emotional enough for a mother who had just lost her baby. This perception was deeply unfair, as people grieve in different ways, and Lindy's composed public face masked profound private anguish. But perception became reality in the court of public opinion. The Chamberlains' religion became a source of malicious rumors. As Seventh-day Adventists, they belonged to a denomination that was misunderstood by many Australians. Horrible rumors began to circulate that the Chamberlains had killed Azaria as some kind of religious sacrifice. Completely false stories spread that Azaria had been dressed in black for sacrificial purposes. Absurd claims were made connecting the Chamberlains to the Jonestown mass suicide which had occurred in 1978, even though there was no connection whatsoever. The media coverage of the case was relentless and often sensationalistic. Newspapers published stories based on rumors and speculation rather than facts. Television news programs aired segments questioning the Chamberlains' story. Current affairs programs produced special features analyzing every aspect of the case, often with a presumption of guilt rather than innocence. The phrase "trial by media" perfectly described what was happening. Comedians made jokes about the case. People at dinner parties debated whether Lindy was guilty. The Chamberlain case became water cooler conversation across Australia. Polls were conducted asking the public whether they believed the Chamberlains were innocent or guilty, as if the question of someone's freedom should be decided by popular opinion rather than evidence. The overwhelming majority of Australians, influenced by the negative media coverage, believed Lindy was guilty. The intense media scrutiny affected every aspect of the Chamberlains' lives. They couldn't go to the grocery store without being recognized and judged. Their children were subjected to cruel taunts and bullying at school. The family received death threats. People would point and stare when they saw the Chamberlains in public. The pressure was enormous and unrelenting. Even before the trial, the Chamberlains had been convicted in the court of public opinion. Even the name Azaria became the subject of rumors. False claims spread that it meant sacrifice in the wilderness in Hebrew when it actually meant blessed of God. These rumors were cruel, baseless, and incredibly damaging. The Chamberlains found themselves defending not just against the tragedy of losing their daughter, but against a campaign of character assassination and religious bigotry. Despite Coroner Barrett's findings clearing the Chamberlains, some experts were dissatisfied. Kenneth Brown, a forensic dentist who had given evidence at the first inquest, felt his conclusions had been dismissed. Brown sent Azaria's clothing to Professor James Cameron in London, a British forensic pathologist with a reputation for expertise. Cameron would examine the clothing and reach conclusions that would change everything. Professor James Cameron concluded that the damage to Azaria's jumpsuit could not have been caused by a dingo. He claimed the cuts were too clean, too deliberate, and were more consistent with being made by scissors. This opinion would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, despite the fact that Cameron was not an expert on dingo teeth or behavior, and despite the fact that he would later be proven wrong in other cases where his forensic evidence was subsequently overturned. In September 1981, police searched the Chamberlain home and seized their yellow Holden Torana. The car was dismantled and subjected to intensive forensic examination. Police took samples from numerous locations in the car: under the dashboard, on the seats, on the floor, on the hinges in the hatchback area. What they claimed to find would become the most controversial and ultimately most discredited evidence in the entire case. Joy Cool, a forensic biologist from New South Wales, tested samples from the Chamberlain car. She claimed to have found significant quantities of fetal blood in the vehicle, specifically under the dashboard on the front passenger seat hinge and on the floor under the carpet. The presence of fetal blood was critical because fetal hemoglobin is present only in infants 6 months old and younger. Azaria was 9.5 weeks old. If there was fetal blood in the car, it could only be Azaria's. Based primarily on Cameron's opinion about the cuts on the jumpsuit and Cool's claims about fetal blood in the car, authorities moved to quash the findings of the first inquest. In November 1981, the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory filed a motion based on newly discovered evidence. A second coronial inquest was ordered, this time with a very different tone and purpose. The second inquest opened in Alice Springs on December 14, 1981, before Coroner Jerry Galvin. From the beginning, it was clear that this inquest had a different objective. The barrister assisting the coroner, Des Sturgis, made his belief evident through his questioning. He believed Lindy Chamberlain had murdered her daughter. The first inquest had been about dingoes and wildlife behavior. This one, as one reporter noted, was about blood. The Crown's theory was horrific and specific. They alleged that Lindy had taken Azaria from the tent shortly after 8:00 p.m. on August 17th, carried her to the family's Torana parked near the tent, and cut the baby's throat in the front seat of the car using scissors. They claimed Lindy had then hidden Azaria's body in a large camera bag, returned to the barbecue area, and pretended everything was normal. Later, according to this theory, while others were searching, Lindy disposed of the body in an unknown location. This theory required the jury to believe that Lindy could commit this horrific act, hide the body, clean up evidence, return to a group of people, and act normally, all within the space of a few minutes. It required believing that she murdered her daughter for no apparent motive, showed no sign of psychological disturbance before or after, and convinced her husband to help cover up the crime. It was in many ways an implausible theory, but the forensic evidence was presented as conclusive. At the conclusion of the second inquest in February 1982, Coroner Galvin found that there was sufficient evidence to charge Lindy Chamberlain with murder and Michael Chamberlain as an accessory after the fact. On September 13, 1982, the trial of Lindy and Michael Chamberlain began in the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory in Darwin. The trial would last 6 weeks and would captivate the nation. The prosecution's case was led by Ian Barker QC, assisted by other experienced prosecutors. Barker presented the forensic evidence methodically and systematically, building what he argued was an overwhelming circumstantial case against Lindy Chamberlain. The trial lasted 6 weeks with testimony from over 100 witnesses. Each day, the courtroom was packed with media observers and members of the public who had been following the case with intense interest. Professor James Cameron testified early in the prosecution's case. Cameron was a pathologist from the London Hospital Medical College who had been asked to examine Azaria's jumpsuit. His testimony was delivered with absolute confidence and authority. He stated categorically that the tears and damage to the fabric were inconsistent with animal teeth and could only have been made by scissors or a similar cutting implement. He demonstrated his conclusions using a doll to show the jury how he believed the cuts were made. Cameron's confidence was persuasive, but it was also misplaced. He had not conducted proper experiments with actual dingo teeth on similar fabric. He had not consulted with experts in animal behavior or dingo biology. His opinion was based largely on visual inspection and his general knowledge of wounds, not on specific expertise in determining whether wounds were caused by animals versus implements. But the jury had no way to know these limitations. They heard an expert from a prestigious London institution stating his conclusions as facts. Joy Kuhl, the forensic biologist from NSW, also provided crucial testimony for the prosecution. Kuhl explained her testing of the samples taken from the Chamberlain's Torana. She testified that she had found fetal hemoglobin in multiple locations in the car, including underneath the dashboard where it would have dripped from above. She explained that fetal hemoglobin was distinct from adult hemoglobin and could only be present from an infant. The implication was clear and damning: Azaria had bled in that car. Kuhl's testimony was technical and filled with scientific terminology that would have been difficult for jurors to fully understand. She spoke about orthotolidine tests, about spectroscopy, about how she differentiated between fetal and adult blood. What she didn't adequately explain was that her testing methodology had significant limitations and could produce false positives. The jury heard confident scientific testimony and had little reason to doubt its validity. Other prosecution witnesses testified about various aspects of the case. Police officers described their investigation and the evidence they collected. Forensic experts analyzed the camping gear, the tent, and other items from the scene. Each piece of testimony was designed to support the prosecution's narrative that Lindy Chamberlain had murdered her baby in the car, that she had fabricated the Dingo story, and that she and Michael had worked together to cover up the crime. The prosecution also made much of Lindy's behavior and demeanor. They pointed to media interviews where Lindy appeared composed and controlled. They questioned why she wasn't more visibly emotional. They suggested that a truly grieving mother would behave differently. This character assassination, while not direct evidence of murder, created an impression that Lindy was somehow abnormal, somehow not reacting as a mother should react, and therefore capable of killing her child. The prosecution also called attention to what they characterized as suspicious behavior by Lindy. They noted that she had appeared calm in media interviews. They pointed to her decision to wear a black dress with a white trim to Azaria's memorial service, which they suggested was inappropriate. They raised questions about the missing matinee jacket, suggesting it had never existed and that Lindy had invented it. Every aspect of Lindy's behavior was scrutinized and cast in the most suspicious light possible. The defense team, led by John Phillips QC, called numerous witnesses to challenge the prosecution's case. More than 24 defense witnesses testified to the Chamberlains' fine character, their obvious grief over losing Azaria, and their reputation as loving parents. Multiple witnesses described encounters with aggressive dingoes at Uluru and testified that such animals were capable of taking a baby. 8 defense forensic experts were called to challenge the prosecution's scientific evidence. Professor Barry Betcher, a highly respected scientist, attacked Joy Cool's conclusions about fetal blood in the car. In detailed technical testimony, Butcher explained why the test Cool used could produce false positives. He showed that adult blood could pass the same test as could mucus, chocolate milk, and various other substances. The reliability of Cool's findings was, Betcher argued, highly questionable. Engineer Les Harris, who had studied dingoes for over a decade, directly contradicted Cameron's testimony about the jumpsuit. Harris testified that a dingo's carnassial teeth are designed to shear through tough material and can cut through substances as strong as motor vehicle seatbelts. He cited examples of captive dingoes removing meat from wrapping paper while leaving the paper intact. A dingo could absolutely have caused the damage to Azaria's clothing. The defense pointed out logical problems with the prosecution's theory. There was more blood found in the tent, on the mattress in the bassinet, and on the tent fabric than what was claimed to be blood in the car. If Lindy had murdered Azaria in the car, why was there so much blood in the tent? 3 independent witnesses heard Azaria cry out at a time when Lindy was visible at the barbecue area. How could Lindy have committed murder when she was nowhere near the baby when the cry was heard? Dingo paw prints were found near the tent. A dingo was heard giving a warning growl before Azaria cried. Lindy had been seen coming from the tent seconds after reporting seeing a dingo. If the prosecution's theory was correct, Lindy had committed murder in a crowded campground full of people within meters of other campers, with no witnesses, no blood trail, and no physical evidence beyond disputed forensic tests. The defense argued this scenario made no sense. Despite the defense's arguments, the prosecution's forensic evidence proved persuasive to the jury. The testimony about fetal blood in the car, delivered with scientific authority by Joy Cool, was particularly damaging. The claim that the cuts on Azaria's jumpsuit were made by scissors, testified to with certainty by Professor Cameron, created doubt about the dingo story. The jury deliberated and reached their verdict. On October 29, 1982, Lindy Chamberlain was found guilty of murdering her daughter. Michael Chamberlain was found guilty of being an accessory after the fact. Lindy, who was pregnant with her 4th child, was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. Michael received an 18-month suspended sentence. As Lindy was led from the courtroom to begin her prison sentence, she was 8 months pregnant. Lindy was taken to Berrima Prison near Darwin. On November 17, 1982, just 19 days after her conviction, Lindy gave birth to her 4th child, a daughter named Kalia. Lindy was allowed to hold her new baby briefly at Darwin Hospital, surrounded by guards. Then Kalia was taken from her and Lindy was returned to prison. This separation from her newborn was another layer of cruelty in an already horrific situation. Michael was left to care for their 3 children alone while his wife sat in prison for a crime she didn't commit. Life in Berrima Prison was a daily struggle for Lindy. She was placed in the maximum security section because of the nature of her conviction. She was a mother convicted of killing her baby, which meant she was subjected to particular scrutiny and at times hostility from other prisoners. Despite being a non-violent offender with no criminal history, she was treated as a high-security inmate. The psychological toll was immense. Lindy maintained her innocence every single day of her imprisonment. She never wavered in her account of what happened at Uluru. She never confessed, never admitted to any involvement in Azaria's death, never showed any sign of the guilt that the prosecution claimed she felt. Her consistency and her refusal to give up hope became a source of strength for her supporters and an ongoing challenge to those who believed she was guilty. Michael Chamberlain faced his own ordeal outside of prison. As a minister, he lost his position when the publicity around the case became overwhelming. The family faced financial hardship due to the enormous legal costs of defending themselves. Michael had to care for 3 children, including a newborn, while dealing with his own suspended sentence and the stigma of being labeled an accessory to murder. The strain on him was visible and severe. The Chamberlains appealed the convictions. They filed an appeal to the Federal Court of Australia in 1983, which was dismissed. They appealed to the High Court of Australia in February 1984, which also rejected their appeal. It seemed that all legal avenues had been exhausted. Lindy would spend the rest of her life in prison. Michael would forever bear the stigma of being convicted as an accessory to his own daughter's murder. The family had lost Azaria, lost their freedom, and lost their reputation. But supporters of the Chamberlains never gave up. A Free Lindy movement developed in Australia and internationally. People who examined the evidence carefully came to believe that a terrible miscarriage of justice had occurred. Questions about the forensic evidence grew louder. Scientists began to publicly challenge Joy Kuhl's blood testing methodology and Cameron's conclusions about the jumpsuit cuts. Pressure mounted for the case to be reviewed. Then on February 2, 1986, something extraordinary happened. An English tourist named David Brett was climbing Uluru when he lost his footing and fell to his death. The massive scale of the rock and the difficult terrain meant it took 8 days before search teams found Brett's body. He had fallen near the base of the rock in an area that was difficult to access, an area that was full of dingo lairs and dens. As police searched the area where Brett's body was found, looking for any personal effects or remains that might have been scattered by dingoes, they made a discovery that would change everything. They found a small piece of weathered, faded cloth partially buried in the sand. When they examined it more closely, they realized what it was: Azaria's missing matinee jacket. The jacket Lindy had insisted Azaria was wearing. The jacket police had claimed didn't exist. The jacket that Lindy supposedly invented. The discovery of the matinee jacket near dingo lairs, in an area that was known to be frequented by dingoes, was devastating to the prosecution's case. It confirmed a key detail of Lindy's story that had been disputed. It was found exactly where one would expect it to be if a dingo had taken Azaria. The jacket's discovery couldn't be explained by the murder theory. It suggested strongly that Lindy had been telling the truth all along. On February 7, 1986, just 5 days after the jacket was found, the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory ordered Lindy Chamberlain's immediate release from prison. After 3 years, 1 month, and 11 days of imprisonment for a crime she did not commit, Lindy walked out of Berrima prison. She had missed 3 years of her children's lives. She had been separated from her newborn daughter. She had endured unimaginable public vilification, but she had never stopped insisting on her innocence. The discovery of the matinee jacket triggered a royal commission into the case. Justice Trevor Morling was appointed to conduct an exhaustive investigation into the convictions of Lindy and Michael Chamberlain. The Morling Royal Commission would examine every aspect of the case, retest evidence, hear from new experts, and determine whether justice had been served. The investigation took over a year. The Royal Commission's findings, released on June 2, 1987, were damning. The Commission found that there were serious doubts and questions as to the Chamberlains' guilt. The Commission determined that the forensic evidence relied upon by the prosecution was deeply flawed. The alleged fetal blood in the Chamberlains' car was not blood at all. It was a sound-deadening compound, a bituminous material that had been sprayed under the dashboard during the car's manufacture. Joy Kuhl's test for fetal hemoglobin had produced a false positive. The substance she tested was not Azaria's blood. It was industrial sealant. This meant the entire foundation of the prosecution's case, the evidence that had been presented as conclusive proof that Azaria died in the car, was wrong. The jury had been misled by flawed forensic science. The Royal Commission also found that Professor Cameron's testimony about the jumpsuit being cut with scissors was not scientifically sound. Cameron had given his opinion without conducting proper experiments. He had been certain in his testimony, but his certainty was not based on adequate scientific methodology. In fact, Cameron would later admit in other cases that his forensic methods were questionable, and several of his expert testimonies in other trials would be proven wrong. Professor Malcolm Chaikin, the textile expert who had testified for the prosecution, made a remarkable admission during the Royal Commission. He acknowledged that he had given his opinion at trial without the experimental basis he would normally expect from a first-year university student. He admitted that his opinion was not scientifically sound, but was rather based on something I may have felt at the time. This cavalier approach to expert testimony had contributed directly to Lindy's wrongful conviction. The Royal Commission concluded that if a jury had heard all the evidence that was now available, including the corrected forensic evidence and the discovery of the matinee jacket, a reasonable jury would have to acquit the Chamberlains. Based on the Royal Commission's findings, the Northern Territory government moved to quash the convictions. On September 15, 1988, the Northern Territory Court of Criminal Appeals unanimously overturned all convictions against Lindy and Michael Chamberlain. The Chamberlains were officially pardoned in 1987, and in 1992, the Northern Territory government paid Lindy $1.3 million in compensation for wrongful imprisonment. No amount of money could give Lindy back the 3 years she spent in prison, the time with her children that was stolen from her, or the reputation that had been destroyed by the wrongful conviction. But the compensation acknowledged that a terrible injustice had been done. A third coronial inquest was held in 1995. This inquest, conducted after the Chamberlains' exoneration, returned an open finding, meaning the exact cause of Azaria's death could not be determined with certainty. This was frustrating for the Chamberlains, who wanted a definitive finding that a dingo had killed their daughter. An open finding still left room for doubt and speculation. For years, the Chamberlains continued to advocate for a fourth inquest that would finally definitively state what they had known all along: a dingo took their baby. They collected evidence of other dingo attacks on humans that had occurred in the years since 1980. They worked with legal experts and advocates. They refused to let the case be forgotten. They wanted their daughter's death certificate to reflect the truth. In December 2011, Coroner Elizabeth Morris announced that a fourth coronial inquest would be held in February 2012. This inquest would consider new evidence about dingo behavior and attacks on humans that had emerged in the 32 years since Azaria's death. Since 1980, there had been 27 documented dingo attacks on humans, 3 of them fatal. In particular, a dingo attack on Fraser Island in April 2001 inches, which a 9-year-old boy was killed, demonstrated that dingoes were capable of attacking and killing children. The Fraser Island attack occurred on April 30, 2001. Clinton Gage, a 9-year-old boy, was attacked by 2 dingoes while walking with his younger brother near their family's campsite. The dingoes dragged Clinton into the bush and killed him before his father could intervene. This tragic incident proved definitively what Derek Roth had been warning about in 1980: dingoes could and would attack children, and such attacks could be fatal. Between 1980 and 2012, numerous other dingo attacks were documented. On Fraser Island alone, there were multiple incidents of dingoes biting or attacking visitors, particularly children. In 1998, a dingo grabbed a 13-month-old baby from a caravan on Fraser Island and began to drag it away before the parents intervened. The baby sustained serious injuries but survived. These incidents showed a pattern of dingo behavior that vindicated Lindy's account. Wildlife experts who studied dingoes after 1980 confirmed what should have been obvious in 1980: dingoes are predators capable of taking prey as large as or larger than a human infant. Dingoes commonly hunt wallabies and kangaroo joeys, which are similar in size to a human baby. They are opportunistic hunters that will take easy prey when available. A baby sleeping in a tent, particularly in an area where dingoes had become habituated to humans and associated campsites with food, would have been vulnerable to attack. Derek Roth, the ranger who had warned about the dingo danger before Azaria's death, lived the rest of his life knowing that his warnings had been ignored and that a baby had died as a result. He testified at both the first inquest and at the trial, consistently maintaining that a dingo could have and likely did take Azaria. The vindication of his testimony came too late to save the Chamberlains from their ordeal, but it validated his expertise and his understanding of dingo behavior. On June 12, 2012, more than 31 years after Azaria's death, Coroner Elizabeth Morris delivered her findings from the fourth inquest. In a packed courtroom with Lindy and Michael Chamberlain present, along with their now adult children, Morris spoke directly to the family. She said, "Please accept my sincere sympathies on the death of your special and loved daughter and sister Azaria. I am so sorry for your loss. Time does not remove the pain and sadness of the death of a child." Coroner Morris then delivered her formal finding: Azaria Chamberlain died at Ayers Rock on 17 August 1980. The cause of her death was as a result of being attacked and taken by a dingo. Finally, after 32 years, the official record reflected what Lindy had screamed on that terrible night in August 1980. A dingo had taken her baby. An amended death certificate was issued to the Chamberlains, replacing the one that had left the cause of death undetermined. Lindy Chamberlain, now Lindy Chamberlain Creighton, after remarrying, spoke to the media after the inquest. She said, "We're relieved and delighted to come to the end of this saga." Michael Chamberlain, speaking separately as he and Lindy had divorced in 1991, said, "This battle to get to the legal truth of what happened to Azaria has taken too long. The case had consumed their lives for more than 3 decades. The vindication was important, but it couldn't erase the years of pain." The Chamberlain case became one of the most famous trials in Australian history and sparked widespread changes. The case highlighted the dangers of forensic evidence that is presented with unwarranted certainty. It demonstrated how expert witnesses can be wrong, how testing methodologies can be flawed, and how juries can be misled by scientific testimony that sounds authoritative but lacks proper foundation. The case led to reforms in how forensic evidence is handled in Australian courts. There were calls for better training of forensic scientists, more rigorous peer review of forensic methodologies, and stricter standards for expert testimony. The Chamberlain case is now taught in law schools and forensic science programs as a cautionary tale about the limits of forensic evidence and the importance of maintaining scientific rigor. One of the most important lessons from the Chamberlain case relates to the presentation of forensic evidence in court. Expert witnesses have a responsibility to present their findings with appropriate caveats and acknowledgments of limitations. When Joy Cool testified about finding fetal blood in the car, she should have clearly explained that her testing methodology could produce false positives and that her findings needed to be confirmed by additional testing. Instead, her testimony implied certainty where uncertainty existed. Similarly, Professor Cameron should have acknowledged that his opinion about the cuts on the jumpsuit was based on limited examination and that he had not conducted experiments to confirm his hypothesis. Expert witnesses who testify with false certainty do enormous damage to the pursuit of justice. They mislead juries, they create convictions based on flawed science, and they undermine public confidence in the forensic science when their errors are eventually discovered. The Chamberlain case also highlighted problems with how forensic evidence is generated and tested. The testing of samples from the Chamberlain car was conducted without proper protocols. Evidence was not preserved appropriately. Multiple people handled evidence without proper documentation. The chain of custody was not maintained to forensic standards. These procedural failures made it difficult to challenge the test results and made it easier for flawed conclusions to stand unchallenged. Modern forensic science has learned from these mistakes. Today, there are much stricter protocols for evidence handling, testing, and reporting. Forensic laboratories are accredited and must meet rigorous standards. Peer review of forensic methodologies is more common. The rise of DNA testing has also provided a more reliable form of forensic evidence than many of the techniques used in the Chamberlain case, though even DNA testing must be conducted and interpreted properly. The Chamberlain case also influenced how Australia thinks about wrongful convictions. Before this case, many Australians believed that wrongful convictions were rare or only happened in other countries. The Chamberlain case proved that the Australian justice system, despite its strengths, was capable of failing catastrophically. This realization led to more support for criminal case review mechanisms, compensation for the wrongfully convicted, and reforms to appellate processes. The case also exposed the power of media to influence public opinion and potentially prejudice legal proceedings. The intense media coverage of the Chamberlain case, much of it negative toward Lindy, created an atmosphere where getting a fair trial was extremely difficult. The cruel rumors about the Chamberlain's religion, the speculation about Lindy's demeanor, and the public's rush to judgment all contributed to an environment where the presumption of innocence was overwhelmed by public suspicion. The phrase, "a dingo ate my baby," entered popular culture, but in a way that trivializes the real tragedy behind it. The phrase has been used as a punchline in movies like Tropic Thunder and television shows like Seinfeld and The Simpsons. While some of these references are made with awareness of the actual case, others treat it as simply a funny Australian phrase without understanding the real suffering it represents. The impact on the Chamberlain family was profound and lasting. Lindy has spoken publicly about the trauma of losing Azaria, the horror of being convicted for her murder, and the difficulty of rebuilding her life after exoneration. She wrote a book, Through My Eyes, published in 1990, detailing her experiences. The book provided her perspective on the tragedy and its aftermath and helped many Australians understand the human cost of the miscarriage of justice. The case also took a toll on Lindy and Michael's marriage. The stress of the trial, the conviction, the imprisonment, and the years of fighting for exoneration created enormous strain. The couple divorced in 1991, 3 years after Lindy's convictions were quashed. Michael remarried and became a teacher and author. He wrote his own book about the case titled Beyond Azaria, Black Light, White Light. Michael died in January 2017 at the age of 72. The Chamberlain children grew up in the shadow of their sister's death and their mother's wrongful conviction. Aiden and Reagan were young boys when Azaria disappeared, and they had to grow up with the public scrutiny and the knowledge of what their family had endured. Kalia, born in prison and immediately separated from her mother, never knew what it was like to have a normal childhood. All 3 of the surviving Chamberlain children have had to carry the weight of this family tragedy their entire lives. The case has been depicted in numerous artistic works. The most famous is the 1988 film Evil Angels, released outside Australia as A Cry in the Dark, starring Meryl Streep as Lindy and Sam Neill as Michael. Streep's performance earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. The film was praised for its relatively balanced and sympathetic portrayal of the Chamberlains, and it helped some international audiences understand the injustice that had occurred. Meryl Streep's preparation for the role was meticulous. She spent time with Lindy Chamberlain, studied her mannerisms and speech patterns, and sought to understand the woman behind the headlines. Streep's portrayal captured Lindy's strength and composure, while also showing the devastating emotional impact of losing a child and being accused of murder. The film depicted the media frenzy, the flawed forensic evidence, and the rush to judgment that characterized the case. The film was directed by Fred Schapisi and written by Robert Caswell, both of whom conducted extensive research into the case. They interviewed people involved in the investigation and trial, reviewed court transcripts, and consulted with legal and forensic experts. The result was a film that was both dramatically compelling and largely faithful to the actual events. For many people, particularly those outside Australia, A Cry in the Dark was their introduction to the Chamberlain case. The film's release in 1988 coincided with the quashing of the Chamberlains' convictions, which gave it added cultural resonance. Audiences watching the film knew that it depicted a real miscarriage of justice that had recently been corrected. The movie helped shift public opinion in Australia, causing some people who had believed in Lindy's guilt to reconsider their position. It also generated international discussion about forensic science, wrongful convictions, and the dangers of media trials. There have also been television movies, including The Disappearance of Azaria Chamberlain in 1983 with Elaine Hudson and Through My Eyes, The Lindy Chamberlain Story in 2004 with Miranda Otto as Lindy. Australian composer Moya Henderson wrote an opera called Lindy based on the case. The Chamberlain story has been told and retold in various media, each iteration adding to the public's understanding of the case. The proliferation of cultural works about the Chamberlain case reflects its enduring significance in Australian consciousness. The case touched on fundamental questions about justice, truth, prejudice, and the power of scientific evidence. It revealed uncomfortable truths about Australian society, including its capacity for religious intolerance and its willingness to rush to judgment. These were lessons that needed to be learned, remembered, and passed on to future generations. The case also sparked important conversations about how the media covers criminal cases. The sensationalistic coverage of the Chamberlain case, the publication of rumors as facts, and the presumption of guilt that pervaded much reporting all contributed to making a fair trial difficult. In the years since, there have been efforts to improve ethical standards in crime reporting, though the tension between the public's interest in crime stories and the rights of accused persons remains challenging to balance. The National Museum of Australia holds a significant collection of objects related to the Chamberlain case donated by or purchased from the family. The collection includes more than 350 objects, including clothing that Azaria wore, items from the campsite court documents, and personal effects. The museum also has Lindy's prison uniform and other artifacts from her time of incarceration. This collection serves as a permanent historical record of the case and its impact on Australian society. One of the most poignant items in the museum's collection is the black dress with white trim that Azaria wore in some photographs. This dress became notorious because of false rumors that the baby was always dressed in black as part of supposed religious rituals. In reality, it was simply a dress that Lindy had made for her son Reagan and that Azaria also wore. The dress symbolizes how innocent details can be twisted into sinister narratives when prejudice and assumption take over. The yellow Holden Torana, the car that was at the center of so much flawed forensic evidence, is also part of the National Museum's collection. The car represents both the tragedy of Azaria's death and the injustice of Lindy's conviction. The blood that was found in this car and presented as damning evidence was actually manufacturing compound. The Torana stands as a physical reminder of how forensic science, when improperly applied, can destroy innocent lives. The museum's collection serves multiple purposes. It preserves historical evidence of one of Australia's most significant legal cases. It provides educational resources for understanding wrongful convictions and the importance of forensic science integrity. It honors Azaria's memory and acknowledges the suffering of the Chamberlain family. And it serves as a warning about the dangers of rushing to judgment and the importance of maintaining the presumption of innocence. Today, more than 44 years after Azaria's death, the Chamberlain case remains relevant. Cases of wrongful conviction continue to occur in Australia and around the world. Forensic science, while much improved, is still not infallible and still requires proper application and interpretation. The media still sometimes creates prejudicial environments that make fair trials difficult. The lessons of the Chamberlain case need to be continually remembered and relearned. Looking back at the Chamberlain case more than 40 years after Azaria's death, several lessons emerge. First, the danger of confirmation bias in investigations is clear. Once police and forensic experts began to suspect the Chamberlains, they interpreted every piece of evidence through that lens of suspicion. Alternative explanations were dismissed. Evidence supporting the Dingo theory was minimized or ignored. The investigation became about proving the Chamberlains' guilt rather than objectively determining what happened. Second, the case demonstrates how forensic science, when improperly applied or when presented with false certainty, can be more prejudicial than probative. The jury in the Chamberlain trial heard from multiple experts who testified with apparent authority and confidence. Joy Kuhl's testimony about fetal blood was delivered as scientific fact. Professor Cameron's opinion about scissors was stated as certainty. The jury had no way to know that this expert testimony was fundamentally flawed. Third, the case shows how prejudice and religious discrimination can infect a criminal investigation and prosecution. The Chamberlains were judged not just on the evidence, but on their religion, their demeanor, and their failure to conform to public expectations of how grieving parents should behave. The cruel rumors about human sacrifice and religious rituals, though completely baseless, colored public perception and may have influenced the jury's deliberations. Fourth, the case highlights the importance of maintaining the presumption of innocence. Lindy Chamberlain was convicted based on circumstantial evidence and disputed forensic testimony without a body, without a clear motive, and without any eyewitnesses to the alleged crime. The prosecution's theory required believing that a loving mother spontaneously murdered her baby for no reason, managed to do so undetected in a crowded campground, and then maintained an elaborate deception for years. Yet a jury found this theory more believable than the simpler explanation a dingo took the baby, just as Lindy said. The Chamberlain case serves as a stark reminder of the fallibility of the justice system. Good people acting in what they believe to be good faith can make terrible mistakes. Police can focus on the wrong suspects. Forensic scientists can reach incorrect conclusions. Juries can convict the innocent. Courts can fail to correct these errors. Only through continued vigilance, openness to new evidence, and willingness to acknowledge mistakes can justice ultimately prevail. Azaria Chamberlain would be 44 years old now if she had lived. She never got the chance to grow up, to go to school, to form relationships, to live her life. She remains forever a 9-week-old baby in photographs, a baby with dark violet eyes who died in the Australian outback on a terrible night in August 1980. Her brief life became the center of a tragedy that extended far beyond her death, affecting her family, the justice system, and Australian society as a whole. For Lindy Chamberlain Creighton, the vindication came, but it came far too late. She spent 3 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit. She endured decades of public vilification and suspicion. She missed irreplaceable time with her children. She lost her marriage. She had to fight for 32 years to get an official acknowledgement of what she knew all along. The injustice done to her cannot be undone, though she has found some measure of peace in knowing the truth is now part of the official record. The story of Azaria Chamberlain and the wrongful conviction of Lindy Chamberlain is a story that should never be forgotten. It reminds us to be skeptical of forensic evidence that is presented without proper scientific rigor. It reminds us to guard against prejudice and assumption in criminal investigations. It reminds us that behind every criminal case are real people whose lives hang in the balance. And it reminds us that the phrase, "a dingo ate my baby," far from being a punchline, represents a mother's terrible truth that no one believed. So the next time you hear someone reference "a dingo ate my baby" in a joke or a casual comment, remember Azaria, remember Lindy. Remember that a real baby died, that a real mother was wrongly imprisoned, and that a real family was torn apart. Remember that the justice system failed spectacularly and that it took more than 3 decades to make it right. And remember the lessons: question forensic evidence, resist prejudice, maintain the presumption of innocence, and never rush to judgment based on incomplete information or public prejudice. Until next time, thank you for watching.